Welcome to Taking Liberties. This is Kieran coming at you from behind the edit desk. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it along to this one, but we have tonight Austen, Lara and Vikas talking about industry subsidies and protectionism, and I'll hand it on over.
Let's talk about SPC Ardmona, and Austin's
You
going to
said
take
this
that
wasn't
one.
going to be depressing.
Well, look, it's only depressing if you think that the Victorian government shouldn't be spending $22 million of taxpayer money in order to keep open a plant owned by the Coca-Cola industry, um, essentially. So SPC is a canning plant. They put fruit in their cans, and that is apparently so valuable to the people of Victoria that they're spending $22 million on it. And I think this is one of those incidences of gross industrial protection. That if you look at the number of jobs saved, I believe it's in the thousands, and we're spending in the millions on keeping the plant open. And the Coca-Cola industry, the parent industry, is actually putting up a fair deal of money, which I believe is 25 million. And when you ask a company that is, and this is not a sack the rich thing, that this is a company, a private company, coming hat in hand to the government and saying, we'd rather not put in our own money to keep this plant opening. Will you please do it for us? And it's much worse, I think, than ordinary individual welfare because they have the capacity to do so, and the fact that they're not willing to do so means that they don't see the plant as being productive. And again, you get into this whole euphemistic notion here of investment, of co-investment, that somehow the government giving money to this company is an investment for the taxpayer. And I think it's just nonsense. And it's a terrible term to use.
You could make an argument, and I don't agree with this, but you could make an argument that there is an investment. Actually, no, I do agree with this, in the sense that the investment is not having to deal with the political clout of the workers who lose their jobs and find it difficult to retrain. Because I find it, I'm going to sound like such a snob when I say this, but I do find it very difficult to imagine that most of the people who are working in candy factory are very, very highly skilled. And Australia's manufacturing base has been moving away for a very long time, so there aren't a lot of positions available for people who don't have a lot of qualification. And it's going to be rough for them to retrain, and it's going to be rough for them to find another job. So the value of this primarily is sit-down money. It's not just for the workers. The workers are a proxy for the unions as well, to take their position, jump on a soapbox, and make a lot of noise at the government. And from the government perspective, $22 million, from the federal government perspective especially, is kind of chump change. Now, I don't know if it's worth putting that chump change into propping up an unproductive factory that, I mean, really, like, I primarily shop at Aldi because I like my things cheap. They have a completely different brand of canned food there and of canned fruit and vegetables there, and they're delicious and fantastic. So the free market has provided us with plenty of alternatives. It's not as though that will be an end to canned fruit in Australia by 2017. There will still be canned fruit. Service will still be there.
So
But
just
the
correct. Sorry, I'd like to correct some numbers from before. Coca-Cola is putting in about 78 million, along with the 22 million from the Victorian government, and the contractual obligation is to have at least 500 full-time jobs over 3 years. So that works out to about 15,000 per worker per year
do you say to have or to add?
to maintain.
Okay. Yeah, 500 people, kind of not worth it. Unless you're dealing with, and I don't know the specifics of where the factory is located, unless you're dealing with a circumstance where the factory is basically the only thing propping up a town's economy. I just don't see the pain being as great as the actual pain suffered by the people on the ground will not be as great as the representations of pain of those people made on their behalf in the public arena. And I think that's really what you're trying to avoid.
Well, and again, though, if you look at this, like I said, it's about 15,000 per year over 3 years, which means that you could also give each employee a bailout package of $45,000 flat cash, um, and shut down the plant. And the realistic thing is that I think if you actually straight up offered many employees, like, if you quit your canning job, we will give you $45,000. Many of them would say, yeah, okay, I can find another job with that. In fact, probably considerably less than that.
I think I differentiate from both of you in the sense that here I am going along the lines of, hey, if Victoria wants to subsidize food, canned goods for me, I am totally supportive of that. It's a higher standard for us New South Welshmen and AC and Territorians, okay? Like, I do not care at all if the people of Victoria want to subsidise that. That is 22 million less
That's an excellent
for
point.
healthcare, for roads, for everything else. That's $22 million less that Victoria is spending on basic services. So keep that in mind. If the people of Victoria want to make the argument that, hey, $45,000 per worker is more valuable than healthcare or infrastructure or schooling or whatever else, that's their problem, not ours. And that's just me coming at it from, I guess you could just say states' rights perspective.
It's a great metaphor for one of the sort of key lessons of the free market and one of the sort of biggest fears you come to when you're first investigating it, which is, what if everyone else is doing the thing and we stop doing the thing? Will it disadvantage us? And the answer, frankly, is no. No, it will not.
Yeah. Okay, so case in point would be, I guess you could say, if you take a look at the OECD, and you take a look at I guess you could say, is it the top 10 OECD countries? I think 2 of them don't have car manufacturers, right? And it's just like, well, hang on. If you don't have a car manufacturer, you clearly can be quite a developed country. Now, the question then becomes, why does everybody need a car manufacturing base? And people will go, oh, it's a prestige factor. Now, we're not even dealing with that when it comes to a cannery. I mean, this is SPC. You can get canned goods from everywhere. Everybody does canned goods. How are we advantaged, even from a prestige perspective, of subsidizing at a federal level SPC? Now, if the Victorians want to make an argument there, and they clearly have, that, hey, Victoria is going to be the canned goods manufacturer of Australia, that is absolutely fine.
Such prestige.
And that is the exact argument that they've made. That is the exact argument that they've made. So I don't actually see the problem. I didn't quite understand why everybody was going, Napthine, you've screwed over the Liberal Party or something like that. When it's just like, well, look, he's taking care of his state. For better or worse, he's taking care of his state. We, as a country, have now shifted this problem from our shoulders to Dennis Napthine into dealing with how the Victorians take this entire business. It is no longer an actual federal issue. It is purely a Victorian issue. Now, from that perspective, I don't see why people were angry or why it's even relevant as much anymore.
Again, it's one of those things. It's a precedent. It's dirty from the get-go that you have this, and it's a classic story that, like, we've got a plant that's unproductive, and we could just shut it down, which in a free market is what we would do. If it's unproductive, we'll shut it down, or we'll cut staff, or we'll find some way to make it efficient using our own capital to the amount that we're willing to invest in it. But instead, now, when you have an unproductive plant, the most productive, efficient thing to do from a rational standpoint is go beg the government, the state government, the local government, the federal government, wherever the factory is, for money to keep it open. And that is now the first thing that I would advise, if I was advising a company, and I was like, oh, you have a plant that isn't producing, okay, well, first thing you should do is go to government and ask them to bail it out. It's literally costless for the company. And it has a potential for millions of dollars of return. And quite frankly, I think they should take the request and can it.
Nice pun there. But we have sort of set a precedent already in Australia where, Holden didn't get funding, Toyota didn't get funding, and SPC Ardmona did not get federal funding. I think we have clearly set a precedent through the federal government that the federal government will not fund you, right? And I don't see the objection to saying state governments can fund it, because that's just competitive federalism.
Well, with regard to Qantas, the federal government, I think, is taking a much, much more reasonable approach on that issue, because they have kept in line with their precedent and said, no, we don't really want to hand over millions of dollars to keep your company afloat. But what they are looking at doing is effectively deregulating the airline, so that rather than trying to solve the problem for them, they are trying to get out of the way of the airline trying to solve the problem for itself. So that could mean a lot of things, like a reduction in taxes. I mean, even a reduction in fuel tax. The excise on fuel would make a huge difference to Qantas, because it's their international arm that is draining all the money out of it, basically. And especially foreign ownership. So I think it's only 49% of the company can be foreign owned, because Qantas did used to be fully federally owned, I think. Yes. So, I mean, by opening up an entirely new source of revenue, that's probably going to do a lot more for the company than handing it that revenue in the first place, and then you leave them in a position where they're dependent because they have nowhere else to go and seek more, because they are just tied up in huge amounts of red tape, because they weren't deregulated fully in the first place. I don't know if there's anything in that solution that can help SPC. I don't know that SPC is being regulated out of existence any more than any other Australian company is, but the lesson, as always, is that government is not that good at solving problems, and the best thing it can do is get out of the way.
I guess I couldn't agree more. I think the government is taking the right tack when it comes to deregulating Qantas. That would fix most of the problem. But having said that, the offer of guaranteeing their loans, that essentially, people don't realize how much of a subsidy it is to be able to say, hey, I, as a company, can borrow from the international market at the government rate of interest. If you or I went out and borrowed internationally, you might be expecting, I don't know, what is it, like 2, maybe 3%. But if you go with a government guarantee, Qantas would possibly get, what is the US Reserve Bank rate? Like, what is it, 0.5%?
About
1%?
0.
I thought it was like 0.5%, but okay, 0%.
No, it's not 0. It's very low, but no, it's very low.
Yeah, okay, so really, really low, and Austin, you can probably check it right now. I'm guessing if it's really low, it's between 0.25 and 5%. But if you can borrow at that, as opposed to the retail rate, which is, like 2.5%, give or take, that amounts to millions and millions and millions of dollars per year of saving that they get. And that is way larger than any direct subsidy in this country that I can think of.
Yeah, in scale terms, I can't think of anything bigger, but I will say, as someone who has been a beneficiary of a similar kind of scheme, and I am talking, of course, about the glory that is HEX loans, when you're in a position where you have no obligation to pay your loan back until you reach a certain income base, which is something that doesn't even happen which certainly is something that doesn't happen when your debts are guaranteed as a I'm not sure what the mechanism is called, but when your debts are guaranteed as a private company by the federal government, there is really not a lot of incentive to live up to the standard. You learn very quickly that, if you need more, there's more there. If you want to take them and repurpose them, you can do that in as much as possible. So it's really a thing that we need to stay out of and get out of. We're already into it.
Austin, I believe you have the federal funds rate?
Yeah, the effective federal funds rate is now 0.07%. 0.07, which is less than inflation. Yeah.
Yeah.
You effectively get paid to borrow money.
Fantastic. The brutal reality is, around the world, you've got these primarily, I guess you could say, Arabian/Middle Eastern airlines that started up because they got really shitty service from government-backed airlines as they flew into the Western world. Now, these guys are obviously very cashed-up sheiks, or very cashed-up royals, and they decided, hey, we have the money, let's start our own airline, and let's provide the level of service that we would expect. And as a result, you've got these airlines that have started up by royal decree, which are phenomenal to fly on, by the way. That's just kind of shit all over the various nationalized airlines or the various national-backed airlines. And that's what's really driving international routes of most airlines around the world down. I guess you could say I don't see the Barnaby Joy/national argument that, hey, this is a matter of pride, we should have this national airline, when essentially what we're saying is we are going to subsidize mediocrity.
Having a shitty national airline is not a point of pride. And this is something that America has like 3 airlines named after the country, and none of them are a point of pride because they all suck. Like, United is one of the worst airline carriers in the world. And it certainly isn't a point of pride for me being an American. You're like, yeah, we have United.
You guys can be really proud of the song that the guy wrote when United broke his guitar. I believe it's called United Breaks Guitars.
Yeah, no, I understand. Actually, America's a prime example of this. You've got, American Airlines, United Airlines, and what was the other one?
US Airways.
And Delta's there too, but Delta's a little smaller.
Well, you've also got Southwest, which is really good, but not named after the US.
It also doesn't try to be an enormous national airline the same scale that United does and US Air does.
I have a really weird interest in US consumer politics and have had for a really, really long time. So airlines is something I've kind of accidentally followed vicariously for a number of years. And it's been really, really interesting to watch consumer satisfaction reports on them because Southwest has kind of consistently topped them out. And a large part of that is that they let you take 2 bags on at standard in your fee. But it's also got to do with they have the least rate of delays or rate of cancellations. But in the last 12 months, Virgin has come into the US market and blown every single airline out of the water. They are head and shoulders above the competition when it comes to consumer satisfaction. There's a lesson of the free market in that.
I'd wager to say that's probably a similar story here in Australia with Virgin Blue.
Yep,
but
I know. I only really fly Virgin. It's the best nexus of price and value. I wouldn't
I
pay
fly
to fly
Tiger.
Qantas.
I take my
Well,
life in my hands and I ride the Tiger to get to my place.
oh look,
You're a
Tiger.
braver man than
Tiger's-
I, Austin.
Yeah, I'm just like I've flown
You
Tiger
know, over
to.
50% of their airlines get to their destination.
50%, outstanding.
At least.
Although, I mean, that's a higher rate of success than my personal airline, which has never ever flown. So, good on them.
Coming back to the point, like, okay, so the point of pride argument, I think it's fallacious to begin with. They're essentially flying taxi. They're not being actually inhabited. They're just going to end up being, I guess you could say, wasting fuel on the flight to get between places. There's enormous environmental cost is related to that. But forcing, as a matter of pride, a mediocre airline to fly international just makes it that much worse from an environmental perspective, as well as the fact that you are now sponsoring mediocrity overseas and basically selling the fact that you have a mediocre international airline to the rest of the world as a point of advertising.
To go right back to the pride, the problem there is directional. You don't derive pride from having a national airline. You have a national airline that's good, and you derive pride from that, which unfortunately is not the situation we are in anymore, if at all we were. Well, no,
Yeah,
I mean, I remember that we were when Rain Man came out, and the safety record of Qantas was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Rain Man, the autistic savant, would refuse to fly any other route to LA than Sydney to LA on Qantas because Qantas was the only airline at that point who had never had a flight that crashed. And so that was a point of pride, but that was also, I think, the 1990s or the 1980s. And by this point, crappy service has detracted from pride. So I just don't see what value is in that argument.
That's our show for this week, and I guess we'll see everybody next week with a brand new panel with a brand new host. Well, actually, no, same old host, but brand new panel talking about what happens in the next week, I guess. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and see you next week.